Check out the lights. Already on. Let's check out hazards and indicators and the hazards. 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 On in the lights, the indicator. Cut the hazards on. And hazards. Go ahead and turn on the hazards. Hazards. The hazards. On the hazards. And cut on the hazards. The hazards. As well as the hazards. The hazards. As well as the hazards. As well as the hazards. As well as the hazards. And cut on the hazard. And the hazards. And the hazards. On the hazards. Cut on the hazards. As well as the hazards on. Hazards. Hazards. Go ahead and cut on the hazards. As well as the hazards. As the hazards. 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 And we'll go ahead and turn on the hazards. The hazards. 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 Go ahead and cut on the hazards. And the hazards. As well as the hazards. As well as the hazards. We'll go ahead and turn on the hazards. As well as the hazards. Turn on the hazards. Hazards. And the hazards. As well as the hazards. As well as the hazards. Hazards on. Hazards. The hazards. As well as the hazards. As well as the hazards. As well as the hazards. The hazards. Hazards. The hazards. Hazards. As well as the hazard. And hit the hazards on. Hazards. And hazards. As well as the hazards. The hazards. Hazards. As well as the hazards. Hazards. As well as hazards. Let's turn on the hazards. 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 Turn on the hazards. As well as the hazards. Hazards. As well as the hazards. As well as the hazards. As well as the hazards. Hazards. And the hazards. Hazards. And the hazards. Hazards. The hazards. 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 Hazards on. Turn the hazards on. As well as the hazards. Hazards. Hazards on. Hazards. As well as the hazards. 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 And cut the headlight. Hazards. Was the has the hazards. 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 Show the indicator and the indicators. Turn on the hazards. Turn on the indicators. The hazards. Hazards. The hazards. Hazards on. The hazards. Hazards. Go ahead and turn the hazard and the hazard. Turn the hazard. The hazards. Turn on the hazards and the hazards. The hazards. It's in the hazard. Hazards. Turn the hazards on. On the hazards.